Welcome to Season 4 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 2, we'll be talking with Robin Hammond about balancing impact. Robin Hammond has dedicated his career to amplifying narratives of marginalized groups through long-term visual storytelling projects. Career recognition includes the winning of 2 World Press Photo Prizes, the R.F. Kennedy Journalism Award, 6 Pictures of the Year International Awards, the W. Eugene Smith Award for Humanistic Photography, and 6 Amnesty International Awards for Human Rights Journalism. He was also named by Foreign Policy as one of the 100 leading global thinkers. Robin is a National Geographic explorer and contributing photographer. He has had multiple National Geographic magazine cover stories, and he's the author of 4 photography books. Furthermore, he is the founder of Witness Change, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing human rights through visual storytelling. Could we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
Well, I guess I wear a couple of different hats. First and foremost, I guess I'm a photojournalist. I contribute to National Geographic magazine and a variety of other publications. But most of my work over the last 10 years has been self-generated projects, a lot of it working on human rights issues, and particularly with marginalized groups around the world. And my other hat is that I'm the founder and director of Witness Change. It's a storytelling organization that seeks to amplify the voices of marginalized groups and in such a way that we can advocate for positive change in their lives.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's great. So I guess maybe starting with Witness Change, just really briefly, like what led you to sort of transition from photography into starting an organization?
Frustration, mostly, I think, that, I started out as a photojournalist with this sort of idealistic vision of what photojournalism was and how perhaps there's an opportunity to contribute positively somehow to the world through photojournalism. But after years of getting the front pages of major publications and seeing that positive impact didn't necessarily come about, and when it did, it was almost like incidental. I realized, I guess, that it's not the job of newspapers and magazines to bring about positive change, right? So I wanted to create an organization with a theory of change that storytelling could make an impact on the world, and that we should maybe start with what impact we want to create and then track back to this type of storytelling that we thought would be able to create that change. And that's why we created Witness Change. It grew out of several projects, work on mental health and with LGBT groups around the world. And also, just to be honest, from a very practical point of view, I had someone who wanted to support my work, and they said to me that they really needed to have a registered charitable status so that they could write it off their tax. So I went into the whole process of registering an organization, which was a real ordeal and real pain and at the time, but actually also forced me to bring on a board and build the structures that enable this to become a proper functioning organization.
That's really interesting. And I guess, you're talking a little bit about the limits of change through journalism. And I don't know, it reminds me of a conversation I've had with a friend recently about, the difference between photojournalism and advocacy and where those lines are, and how do you disentangle that, especially if you have, you're coming at something. The reason why maybe you're documenting something is because you have a passion to influence the world in a certain way. So how do we juggle that if we are doing photojournalistic work?
So I think that, I guess, something I just want to make clear is that storytelling for storytelling's sake is absolutely fine. So I don't want to sound like self-righteous, like, if you're not doing change-making work, that you're somehow wrong. I think, storytelling is super important for understanding our world and, documenting our history and all that. But for me, I think I've done a lot of work in developing countries, in places where people are facing really difficult circumstances, and I'm acutely aware of my privilege and that it's 100% accidental, and I no more deserve my privilege than these people deserve their lack of privilege. And so, and it's kind of like a cheesy thing to say, but, and people, and maybe I ridicule saying this, but, with privilege comes that responsibility, right? And but I actually think it's kind of a cliche because it's true. I believe so anyway. And I think that there is an absolute obligation for those of us who are lucky enough to have the resources to live this relatively comfortable life to somehow help out people who aren't. And so, and then, when you think about storytelling, I totally believe that we understand ourselves and each other and society through the stories we tell. And if those stories are somehow wrong, I think that our approach to supporting people can be ineffective or even harmful. So, part of my approach is, ensuring that that I have a really good understanding of the people I'm documenting, but even more so in recent years, it's about trying to support people from those communities to tell their own stories. And I think that there's we're talking about the ethics of storytelling here, and there's definitely questions around who should be telling whose story, right? And I think that that's become a big part of my work too, is making sure that those who are at the heart of the issues that we're discussing have an opportunity to contribute to the narratives that create our understanding and therefore the attitudes and behaviors towards them.
Yeah, absolutely. And how did you sort of come to develop your understanding of ethics in this process and your understanding of the power of photography? And side note, we actually we have a T-shirt on photography is a superpower and it comes with responsibility. So it is a total cliche, but I think it is true. So I totally agree with you there. But yeah, how did you sort of develop those attitudes and those beliefs in your own about your own work?
Yeah, so I think it's continuously evolving. I don't know if I have all the answers for that. But I think I was impacted a lot by a philosopher called Peter Singer, who's an Australian philosopher, and his work on various issues. But his work's certainly changed my life and the approach to my work, and especially around our obligations towards those people who are going through difficult circumstances. I've considered a lot where I can contribute the most in a sustainable way, and I feel like there's probably a number of things that any of us can do if we decide that trying to make a positive impact in the world is what we want to do. But I do believe in the power of storytelling. So I think that that's what I do as a profession, and if I can, I guess, point my lens towards the things that I think matter, and then use my privileged access to platforms to be able to, reach audiences who can make a difference in those situations, then that's probably where I should be best spending my time.
There was something that you posted a couple of years ago, and it was actually what sort of first sort of brought you up on my radar, I guess, was about your project Condemned. And you had posted a really vulnerable, because I think a lot of what you're talking about is sort of that vulnerability of recognizing your privilege and recognizing, responsibilities that you have, but also I think recognizing maybe how it isn't simple. You said yourself, your ethical negotiation of things is evolving. And I think that takes a certain type of vulnerability to say, right, I'm still learning, I'm still figuring it out. And I think that's what you did really well in an Instagram post that I saw, in which you sort of said that, you'd posted this photograph and it received a lot of heat about thinking about consent in terms of people's mental health capacity. And I thought that the way you addressed that was really admirable, because I think a lot of times people, when we receive pushback on ethical decisions, I think it can be very hard to step back and say, right, actually, fair point, fair play. Maybe I should think about this more, or maybe, there are valid points why, this is why I made the decisions that I made, but I can, but to engage in that instead of just saying like, it's my right, or this is my job, or, I think that we're very quick to sort of defend. And we don't often take that time to take stock and say, wait, okay, actually, we can all learn from this. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, because I really appreciated that post that you'd made.
Well, I mean, I think social media is probably the worst place in the world to have those kind of conversations, right? Because it's so reactionary, and there's no space for nuance or deeper understanding, or but so I mean, and that situation. So maybe I should just backtrack a little bit. And I've done for those who don't know, I've done a lot of work on mental health in developing countries, and really the sort of intersection between mental health care or lack of and human rights. And this project started in Sudan in 2011 when I was commissioned to document the referendum for independence in that country. So I had arrived there with a journalist friend of mine, and we were working for the Sunday Times newspaper, and usually I don't cover big news stories, and we got there and there was like hundreds of photographers and cameramen, and we realized pretty quickly that we needed to find a different story rather than just pictures of people putting votes into a ballot box, which is initially what I was doing, but then everyone else was. And for a newspaper, they might as well get their story from the wires, right? Then send somebody if it's just going to be a generic image of that. So we were driving down this road and saw a young girl with some intellectual disability begging on the side of the road. And I said to the driver at the time, what happens to people with mental health issues in your country? And he very casually replies, oh, we put them in the prison. And I said, okay, let's stop the car, let's go to the prison. And I managed to negotiate access. And getting in there was actually relatively easy, because the prison was very proud that they were giving the inmates opportunity to vote in the referendum. And when I got there and saw like dozens of people in shackles, and many of them were naked, and the place was filthy. And it's one of these places that you smell before you see, and it was horrific. And as soon as I got in there, I was reminded of work which really influenced me as a younger photographer by Eugene Richards, who had photographed people in really terrible conditions who were living with intellectual disability or mental health issues. And I started documenting, and anyway, there was this one young man at the end of the room sitting by himself, naked in this chain, which looked something out of the era of slavery. And I do remember very clearly like crouching down to take his photograph and being struck at the time of like, it was just the right thing to do. So, many people in these different cells were able to let me know in their own way whether or not it was okay for me to be there, whether they understood why I was there. But he didn't acknowledge me at all. And I was really struck at the time as to whether that was the right thing to be doing. On one hand, I had the voice of Eugene Richards in my head, and all these other people who had documented human rights issues and said that this is a documentation of a human rights abuse, and this needs to be done. At the same time, he was an individual who didn't have the opportunity, who was in a very vulnerable situation and didn't have the opportunity to, or necessarily the capacity to be able to consent to the image being taken. And I decided, and this is actually one of the sort of, I guess, catalyzing moments for what I would hope would become my activism. The way that I justified it at the time, and I think there's definitely a conversation as to whether or not this is okay, was I said, okay, the only way that this picture is going to be taken is if it is really being made to make a difference in his life and the lives of the other people in these prison cells. So I took these photographs, and I guess out of a sense of responsibility, contacted local NGOs, and it was very hard to get anyone to go in there. And there was definitely conversation about whether that was the right thing to be doing or not. But I kind of feel like, and I wonder even today whether I would take that photograph. Because if someone said to me, "Is it okay to take that picture?" I would also have concerns about that, right? So, but I also kind of feel like there's a hierarchy of concerns. There's somebody's rights to privacy and decency and dignity, but also there's their rights to liberty, right? To not be chained up. And is it okay? So this is a question, right? The rhetorical question: is it okay to potentially infringe on someone's right to privacy if it means they have liberty? So maybe there is like a this hierarchy of concerns. And I kind of believed at the time, and I kind of still do, that young man would much rather have me take his photograph in a vulnerable situation and be free than not take the picture and him still be in chains today. And the thing is, though, of course, when you're taking the photograph, you don't know the outcome. So it's a hard one. But I will say that those images contributed to 80 of the 90 people in those cells being released. It contributed to the funding of millions of dollars to Handicap International, so they could continue their programs, including the program that set those people free. And it influenced a massive pharmaceutical company to adjust its policy towards mental health care in sub-Saharan Africa. So I don't regret taking that picture because of those outcomes, but it's we talk about these ethical dilemmas, right? It's like when we do Witness Change, do workshops, we have a massive part of our conversation is about consent and about the safety and dignity of the people who we're photographing. And it's a difficult one that I don't have like black and white answers to. But I would just say that I think when we're in those situations that we have to consider, I think, as I say, this hierarchy of concerns. I believe, and this has happened subsequently with other situations where the documenting of someone in a vulnerable position has resulted in them having, I think, a greater outcome. I guess the benefit much more outweighs the negatives of that loss of privacy in that moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's so complicated, but I think exactly what you're sort of demonstrating in your description of this is that, it's complicated, but there's value in, I guess, talking through it and thinking through it and taking that time. And because I think that sometimes it's easier to have that sort of rote response that like, it's my job, so I do it. Or I'm against it for all these, for very good reasons, and so I don't do it. But I think engaging with it and weighing that responsibility is really important. Equally, it's really important to know our red lines. So if we are just like fundamentally not comfortable with doing something, that's great too. But I think it's that messiness in the middle that I think is really worthy of that time and consideration. And I think it's hard.
And just also not doing it is also a choice which comes with consequences. So as a documentary photojournalist, whatever we want to call ourselves, advocate, if I didn't photograph that person and then didn't get it published, would the weight of that be on me now, right? Like, and there's, there's many situations, and I think this is, one of the hardest things in my job, many situations where I felt like I should have done more, but taking a photograph is not so difficult. Like, I mean, the job of photography is difficult, but actually clicking the shutter is not so difficult. Like, trying to get someone out of chains and then making sure that they have the medical care they need and the economic support so they don't end up back in that situation, that's hard. But taking a picture, and if taking a picture can then get the support that leads to all those things, it's kind of like the least we can do, maybe. But having said that, and this is why I can think that, I appreciate this conversation, is that when these conversations happen on social media, it's just a place for great, one-liners that, sort of just like get lots of likes without, any time for these sort of like deeper conversations about considering the deeper implications of what we do or not.
Yeah, totally. I think I'm glad you, appreciate this conversation, because that's exactly why I wanted to start this podcast, to create a space where these conversations can play out in a much more holistic way and maybe have a little bit more space for it. Are there any other ethical dilemmas that you sort of look back on in your own practice that maybe you wish you'd done differently that you'd like to share with us?
There seems to be this narrative out there that photojournalists don't really care about the people who they're documenting and they're just there to get the picture and the credit. Like, I just know so many people who don't talk about the great things they do. And most of the people I know, I don't know, maybe it's just a select bubble, I'm not sure, but seem to be super nice people who do go out of their way to support people in difficult situations. But I guess when to talk about the ethical dilemmas, it's like, I totally agree with those who would say that we have to be a human first and a journalist second. And I also would advocate for us, taking action to support somebody over than saying we're an objective observer and we can't interfere. I think that's crap. I think that this idea that we can document a situation and help in a much larger way than help an individual. I don't subscribe to that at all. I feel like, because often that doesn't happen, right? Often it does go on the front page of a newspaper and nothing happens. I would say that, if we have someone in front of us in a difficult situation, we have an obligation to help them. And we can also document at the same time. But I think that, there have been times when I felt like I wish I'd done more for the people whose lives I've documented. And I feel like there are definitely occasions where I have, but there are also other times when it's just been too much and I've walked away, and that stays with me now. And there are definitely situations where, I don't know, I wish I'd taken more action. So I think that's something I consider and an ethical dilemma, but also something that stays with me.
I think that there's something really interesting in that as well that relates to maybe something that you said earlier about how like choosing not to take the photograph is a choice that has repercussions. And just like choosing not to intervene in a situation is a choice that has repercussions. Like all of these things in action, I guess, is as much a choice as action. And I think that is a really interesting idea, because I think that sometimes we think, well, as journalists maybe, or as photographers, or as, if we're not intervening, then we're avoiding maybe the ethical implications of what that means if we intervene. And so I think it is very tricky, isn't it?
Yeah. And also intervening can be hard, right? And sometimes, and I can speak from experience, it can be risky too, right? So it's like, sometimes intervening means putting yourself between people in that place in power and people who are vulnerable. So you can be putting yourself at risk too.
Or other people with you. Yeah. Or if you're working with a fixer or something, thinking about that as well.
100%. I mean, and so there's been situations where right. So the people, I have to think about the people I'm working with more than my own, again, I just have this, I walk around with this protective bubble of being a white person with a British passport, and the local people don't have that. So, and I leave. And, I just wrote a letter of recommendation for my Ethiopian fixer who's seeking asylum in USA. I worked with him like 7 or 8 years ago. But in that letter, I had to describe about the threats against us by government officials. I left. They were never going to arrest me, but it's him that they threatened. And now, years later, not directly relating to our situation, but maybe part of it, is he's now a refugee. So the consequences are just like often so much more severe for people who are living in those places.
Yeah. Something that it seems like a bit of a theme as well of something that you're talking about, because you're talking a lot about impact on the people that we're working with, but also like the knock-on impacts of the work you're creating. How do you sort of think through impact when you're going into project? Or maybe what recommendations would you have for other photographers who maybe are approaching a new project and needing to think that through?
What I'll say is probably obvious, but it's or maybe not. So I'm just going to say it anyway. It's talking to local people and experts, right? So a very concrete example is, we've been doing this project for 3 years now called 1,000 Dreams, where we support refugees to become photographers of their own communities. And we went into that project with a very clear idea of what we wanted to do in order to create these stories that were going to challenge the toxic narratives around refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. And when I sat down with someone who's with lived refugee experience, it flipped it on its head. We had approached this totally as outsiders with thinking we knew exactly how we were supposed to do it. But when we spoke to people with lived experience and then other professionals who are working in mental health with refugees, our project fundamentally changed. So I guess that's a key thing, right? Is like, it's great to have a vision of what you want to do, but you have to include local people or people with experience from those communities, because your idea could just be wrong. And again, it's a part of that thing of like, while we wanted to create a project that elevated the capacity of refugees to tell their own stories, so that they could contribute and hopefully change the narrative about refugees, our whole structure needed to be adjusted with the guidance of people with lived experience and those professionals from that field. So, I mean, and it's the same when it comes to impact, right? So, I think there's just so many examples of well-meaning non-governmental organizations going into a place to kind of impose solutions without enough consultation with local people, and it just going wrong. So with the work I do, but also with when we're developing like an approach to impact, it's always in consultation with the local folks, because again, we could do if we're not in consultation with them, it could be ineffective. At worst, it could be harmful. So we're always. I just had a conversation yesterday with a group who said, "Okay, so what can we do to create impact?" And I was kind of like, "Well, exactly. What should we do?" So it's discussing with them like who we need to reach and what kind of stories need to be told in order to create the impact that's going to support them to do their work.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking also when we're photographing in a context that might be new to us, like if we're working with a fixer or something, like they're gonna know much better as well what impacts they could experience personally, or what impacts the people that you're photographing could experience when photographs go out, and things that we might not be cognizant of.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so, and I've done my project Where Love's Illegal, documenting LGBT stories of survival from around the world. I've done that in 14 countries, and in every situation, it was vital that I worked with a local organization, because, they help me to access folks, but also, to guide me, make sure I'm not messing up along the way, and to make sure that, the outcomes are going to benefit the people whose lives we're documenting in a way that's authentic to them rather than what I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a really interesting project. Could you speak to that a little bit more, or any ethical sort of considerations that have come up?
Sure. I mean, so, if I just talk quickly about the genesis of that project, I was shooting in Lagos, Nigeria, for National Geographic. We're doing a story on Lagos, which is the commercial capital of Nigeria. We're talking about the African megacity. And I heard about 5 young men in the north of the country who'd been arrested for doing air quotes, committing gay acts. I met them when they'd come out of prison. They'd been tortured. They were now homeless. They were in a really bad way. And I said, I want to document their story. And they said, look, you're fine to record our voices, to write down what we say, but there's no way you can take our photographs. It's just way too dangerous. So I kind of said, look, I'm a visual storyteller. That's kind of going to be hard for me. Is there not a way that we could potentially photograph you in a way that you felt safe? That was kind of met with confusion. And I said, look, I'm photographing with this Polaroid camera. What if we discussed how your photograph is going to be taken? I take the photograph, I give you the Polaroid. If you think it's okay, you give it back to me, I get to use it. If not, you tear it up, you keep it, whatever. And that actually became the whole structure of the whole project. It became this collaborative portrait project shot on large format Polaroid, where everyone got the opportunity to talk about how they wanted to be presented, but also to approve the images in terms of whether they would put them at risk or not. Because, as the title suggests, Where Love is Illegal, this is predominantly photographed in places where who these people are and who they love, how they identify, could get them in trouble with the authorities. So it was a really, I guess, unique approach for me, but also I think much stronger for the fact that they got to contribute to how they were seen, which is actually also really, really important, especially for any marginalized group, right? Where the narratives of who they are controlled by more powerful groups, to give them an opportunity to, for some of them, for the first time in their lives, have control over how they're seen and how they're heard, I think is really important, and it's fundamental to this project. And in this project, they all handwrite their own testimonies, and their testimonies are also put in the book, and those are the texts that we publish on the website too. So really, the idea is to give them, or to give them back, or to support them to have the agency over how they're seen in the world, when they live in situations where that is not available to them.
I think it's a really interesting method to use Polaroid, because, I guess that really removes the fear that, the photograph could still exist out there in the world. And I think that's really interesting. That's a really interesting method. Is there anything that I should have asked but didn't?
No, I mean, I guess, I would just say that, my work has evolved a lot in that I still work as a photojournalist, but a big part of my work now is about supporting folks from marginalized groups to tell their own stories. And so increasingly what we do as an organization is try to elevate the capacity of folks who haven't had the opportunities to learn how to tell their own stories in a professional way, or don't have access to the platforms that where they might be seen and heard in a way that's authentic to them. So we've done that now with 1,000 Dreams, our refugee project, and that's sort of, we've now trained 50 refugees to tell so far 750 stories around Europe. We're doing another 2 workshops this year in Barcelona and in Belgrade, and that's a really amazing project for us in that we give people photography gear which they get to keep, so cameras, lighting equipment, audio equipment. We train them over a week and then have 6 months of mentoring, and they go out and they tell the stories of their own communities. So I think I guess I'm trying to, for me, I mean, one, I'm doing this because I think it's the right thing to do, but two, also for me as well, I feel like it's a rebalancing for me, I guess, internally, to try to not be the one as this, white, privileged, middle-aged guy telling the stories of vulnerable communities, and trying to use the privileged access I've had to education and to money that can buy equipment, and to able to fly to Washington, D.C. and meet National Geographic, to be able to do all that stuff that other people don't have because of the situations in their lives, to be able to offer some of that, so access to some of that to some of the other folks through the work we're doing. So I know, I think that as an ethical consideration, it's great. I love taking pictures. I never want to stop doing that. But I think that maybe we can play other roles than just pushing the shutter, right? Maybe we can also be supporting people who don't have those opportunities to be the ones behind the camera and to be telling the stories of their own communities as well. I don't think it's an either or though, right? I totally. So I'm not one of those who believes that only people from their community can tell their stories, but I also recognize 100% that there are sections of our society or of our world that haven't had that chance, and that there's a very small privileged section of society who's been doing all the storytelling, and so that it just needs a bit of rebalancing. And I think that we don't have to give up our jobs, I think, to enable that, but I think that we should be enabling it.
Yeah. And the last question that I like to ask everyone is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
I think it's about being, ethics makes me think of truth, and I know that that's like such a wobbly term in the world of journalism, but I think it's like trying to be authentic to the folks whose lives you're documenting. I feel like also in the process, in the way that we document, I feel very strongly that we need to be making it clear about our process as storytellers, in that we need the audience to know whether a image is constructed or not. I get upset when I find out that, quote marks, documentary images are staged. I think it's about respecting the people in the communities whose lives we're documenting.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Salgu Wismath on queering photography. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to make the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.